Installment number 3, Holidays and the Example of Sodom and Gomorrah. We're in 2 Peter here, and we're going to look starting at verse number 4. Now, this is the second time that the New Testament mentions Sodom and uses an unusual Greek word for it. We told that this morning. For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment, and spared not the old world, but saved Noah the eighth person, and so forth. And here it says in verse 6, turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them with an overthrow, making them an ensample unto those that should after live ungodly. Now, the first Greek word we saw when it was used in Jude, means a model that is representative of the whole. In other words, it is a word that characterizes each and every individual. So what the New Testament is telling us is that this is an example of something. And of course, it is an example of God's judgment. And you're going to say, well, now, Pastor, wait one second. The sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was homosexuality. And I'm here to say that that is really not what brought fire down on Sodom and Gomorrah. It was part of it, but it's really irrelevant. The sin itself, that is what type it is irrelevant to the case. We saw that this morning when we looked at accumulated wrath. We saw Jesus saying, it shall be more tolerable for those in Sodom than those in the other cities he mentioned. Now, what does that mean? It means that these other cities did not commit homosexuality. They committed sins against light. And collectively, that collective mindset of rejecting light brought judgment down on those cities. And that's exactly what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. The sin or the category of sin is irrelevant to the rejection of light and how much light they had. Now, we're not condoning anything. We're just simply telling you that that's how it happens. And we have scriptures to back us up. More tolerable for Sodom. They committed this sin. Well, the other cities Jesus mentioned didn't commit that sin. Why will it be more tolerable? Because Sodom only had so much light and God judged them, and these cities had more light. Therefore, more responsibility, more punitive measures when called into account. So, the Apostle Peter here, though, uses another Greek word, and it means a model for imitation. In other words, God says, just look at this group. Here's what they did. They're an example of why I bring judgment. And they are a model for imitation. I am going to use this very same type situation for doing things in the future. Doing what things? Judging people. Now, what did they do? We're going to discuss some of these other things that we have mentioned on Wednesday night. Let's get right to the crux of the matter. Turn back with me to the book of Genesis, chapter 13. Genesis chapter 13. Two times we have words that indicate Sodom being an example of something. In chapter 13, we have verse number 10, God telling us that Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld the plain of Jordan. It was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord. Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan and separated themselves from Abraham, the one from the other. Abraham dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain by pitching his tent toward Sodom. That's where he wanted to be. So the first thing we need to see is that this particular location was as lush and as plentiful and as prosperous as the Garden of Eden. Now, if we were to compare, we could say like the United States of America. There's no country like ours. There's no country agriculturally that produces like ours. Ours is a lush and plentiful land. And that's what we're trying to do, draw an analogy here between the example of Sodom and why we're giving this very stern warning about the United States of America, and the fact that God has already judged one nation and they had only a certain amount of light. God is sure to judge this nation because we have more light than anyone perhaps has ever had. So, we see then in verse number 13 two words, but the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. Now, the word wicked there is actually the word ra, and you have met this word before in Genesis chapter 2 and in Genesis chapter 3. Ra is otherwise translated evil, and it is associated with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It is an adjective in the plural, and it means they were evil. And here's the key: as a group. You see, it just wasn't one man or 10 men out of the whole population. The totality of the population was giving themselves over to evil. And therein is the key, because we're talking about a remnant principle here. So, this business of them being wicked means that they were becoming saturated with evil as a population. Now, it's not that every unbeliever is not evil. But you'll remember when we talk about the hardening of the heart and the blacking out of the soul and the greater degrees of sin and punishment, that there are some people that can be more evil than other people. When you get to the point where you're about to black out your soul, you're at maximum potential for evil there. And so therefore, that means you as an individual. But when you get a whole population that's about to do that, God considers that in a different category. It's like I was talking to Brian Mabry about Hurricane Mitch. And we were talking about the fact that it was so devastating down there in those South American countries, Central American countries, and so forth. But then you get the news, and they go back to the natives, and they said, well, do you know why we got all this rain? Because we have made the water god mad. And Brian said, yeah, it's Jacuzzi, the great god of the swirling waters. I thought that was great. Anyway, why did that group get hit so hard? Simply because, as collectively, their mindset is against Jesus Christ. And throughout history, when you have groups of people, global disasters, such as the flood, Noah's flood, you have the population collectively dipping down to the blackout of the soul. And that's what was happening here. Now here we have the word sinners. Kata, we've seen it before. It means to miss the mark of God's standard. And again, the plural was added. What characterized these men is that as a group, they were heading toward blackout of the soul. So you get maximum saturation of evil. You get maximum saturation of people who are about to commit the sin unto death. There's the word exceedingly there. It is ma'od, and it means to a greater degree or beyond the limit. We use a cliche nowadays. They were pushing the envelope, and that's exactly what was happening here. But again, it wasn't just one or two. It was collectively. Now, so you have the percentage of population with the gravity of sin, and they were beginning to push God's divine set limit before he pours out judgment upon them. Now, let's go from here to chapter 18, where we get some other information about this particular group of people. It's interesting that in several occasions, God himself comes down to verify collective blackout of the soul. We have it at the Tower of Babel. God says, let us go down and see. Let's verify it. Jesus Christ here came down to verify it with two of his guardian angels in his pre-incarnate state, and they were going into Sodom and Gomorrah in order to see if it was true. Now, what was it that they were going to see? Let's go to chapter 18 and verse number 20. Jesus says here, two becauses. I've come down because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great. Now, the word cry is zak in the Hebrew, and it means to cry out. But again, you have to go to the context to find out what kind of cry it was. The cry was a cry of protest regarding frustration. Now, how do we know? Come with me to chapter 19. These particular people had gotten to a state where evidently the only thing that would satisfy them was to keep their mind on sexual matters. And they couldn't get fulfilled. It had gotten beyond the point where they could be satisfied. It's almost like the old Rolling Stone song, I can't get no satisfaction. That's this case right here. That's how they were. And that was their cry. Why did it come before God? Because they were bitter before God. God, and remember, evil, the best of life apart from God, whether self-righteous or unrighteous. So here's an unrighteous case. And they cry before God in protest, why don't you satisfy me? I want to be satisfied. Your every attention ought to be given toward my satisfaction. And we see this because when the angels came into Sodom, it says in verse 4, before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, compassed the house round, both old and young. That's important, because we're talking about collective blackout of the soul, not in just an elderly population, but in a younger population that came to the age of accountability, and God was holding them into account. And they were becoming hardened in their heart as well toward this dissatisfaction. And the cry is coming up before the Lord. We're going to see why in just a little bit. But it was a loud and noisy cry, a cry of frustration. They gathered in protest that they were discontent with their condition. So it says, they called unto Lot, where are the men that came into thee this night? Bring them out that we might know them. They were so bored with the general run-of-the-mill sex in the city that they wanted new sex, new adventures, new notches on their belt and bedpost. And so bring them out. We want something new. We're bored with it. We're frustrated. And the young and old together, all the men of the city came. So what did it say? Lot went to the door and shut the door after him. In other words, he went outside. Brethren, don't do wickedly. I have two daughters. Now, this is how we know they wanted sex, and they were discontent. I pray you, I've got two daughters. We'll bring them out to you. Do ye to them as is good in your eyes. Only unto these men do nothing. They came under the shadow of my roof. We have studied this before. When somebody came under your roof, the ancient custom was you died in protecting them and providing for them. They now were your responsibility. So he was willing to give his daughters to try to placate them so that these men would not be molested. As it came, it says, we'll deal with you, says verse 9, worse than with these men. They pressed upon the man, even Lot, to break the door. The men put forth their hand, the angels, and pulled Lot into the house to shut the door, and they smote the men that were at the door of the house with blindness, both small and great. Here again, this is the reason Sodom and Gomorrah got judged. The sin of homosexuality is part of it, but it's incidental to what was happening in their heart with light. There's the key. And there's the key to the United States of America and why I give the clarion call. We need to be cautious with this business of holidays because it gives light to those we love, and if they reject the light, the judgment is at the door. Let me tell you, judgment is close, and I believe that it is. They smote them with blindness, verse 11. But note this. This shows their total frustration, so that they wearied themselves to find the door. They wanted to know these men so badly that even in their blind condition, they still started pressing lots out to try to open that door and find these men and have a new sexual experience. It was the cry of protest to God, of discontent for their utter frustration. Does that sound like Christmas and our young people to you? The cry of discontent. Is this all? But Johnny down the street, he's got this and that and the other. Why didn't you get this for me? And that's what we have. Cry of discontent. Whether it's sexual frustration or material frustration, what difference does it make? It is still a cry, a protest to God. Why don't you give me more? All right, now, let's go back to chapter 18. Chapter 18 and verse 20. The cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great. This Hebrew word rob, cow perfect, third person singular, and should be translated in this fashion. Will you say, Pastor, it's just talking about a very loud noise. But the question is, why was it loud? Perfect tense means a completed action. Why was it loud? This particular word means it has become great because the crowd has become many. That's what it is. It is a great noise because it is a great crowd. What do we have? We have the collective protest. Oh, it might have started off with 10 people, but all of a sudden it's the whole city. Obviously, when we sing here, if we have just our regular group or if we have it on the Christmas cantata, it's usually filled. Which is louder? Well, you'd say, Pastor, it only makes sense. It's louder because there are more people involved, and that's what's here. It is a great cry or a loud cry because numerically now we have more people lending their voice, protesting toward God. It is a collective mindset of protest against God for dissatisfaction. And that is the reason that Sodom and Gomorrah was judged. We'll see here in just a little bit. If there had been fewer people committing this sin, they would have never been judged. Or Jesus said, if the mighty work, if they had just a little more light, they would not have been judged like they were. They had enough light for God to do this, but when compared, they didn't have more than this group. Now, let's take the United States of America and Sodom. The very same thing is happening. I can feel it. You can sense it. Debbie Harrington prayed a prayer last Wednesday night. Our population is getting rougher. You can see it. We're becoming crude and rude and ill-mannered and no care. And it's not just older folks, and it's not just the folks out there in the workforce. It is our young people, and it is our young people going all the way down to I'm talking young people who curse and swear and spit and chew and who tell off mom and dad and who tell off teachers, and more of them are handling it. Go to your average PTA meeting today where you have young kids, and the moms that bring them are tattooed to the neck and ankles. They've got earrings in their nose and in their eyelids, in their tongues and so forth. Their belly button showing, and these are the moms bringing the kids in. That's what happens, and some of you can attest to that more than others, unless you work in different school districts, perhaps, I don't know. But I'm saying this, is that more and more people are becoming part of that collective group of protesting God because they're discontent. They're bored with life. And what they think is, if I just had another new toy, until I'm tired of this toy, until I have another toy, just like with Sodom. I need another adventure sexually. But the sin is irrelevant. The point is the collective consensus. All right, let's move on. Chapter 18, verse 20 again. It says, their sin is very grievous. And it is the word, again, the word very is the word exceedingly. It's pushed to the limit. But the word grievous here, kabod, again is in the Cal Perfect, which means that the action has now become complete. They have pushed the limit so far that the next thing God has to do is verify that the envelope has burst, and then comes the judgment. And that's why Christ and these two angels were here. Cal Perfect in both instances. The cry has become great. It's a complete cry. Everybody in that city except for Lot and his two daughters was crying out to God in frustration. And the sin itself is very grievous. Again, Cal Perfect. Everybody is doing this very same thing, the sin of protest. So, the percentage of the population, the gravity of iniquity, they have burst the bubble and gone over the top with God's long-suffering and patience. Judgment is about to fall. All right. Let's go, therefore, to the remnant principle. And the upshot of this study. Verse number 23. Abraham drew near and said, will you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Here was the point Christ tried to make. There's not a whole lot there. In other words, he's saying, sure, I'm not going to do that. I'm a just God, but that's why we're here. We're here to verify the fact that there, excuse the phrase, ain't nobody righteous there. Or if there is, we're going to get them out of the city. I know how to deliver the righteous out from under the judgment and to reserve the ungodly to punishment. So here he gives the remnant principle and why it was that God brought judgment. And that's why I say, during these, quote, holiday seasons, we can be in the world, but let's not be of the world. We are the salt of the earth. We are protective and preventative. As long as we're here learning doctrine and stay in fellowship, they have an opportunity because God revolves history around those in fellowship. The minute we compromise, we're just as guilty of causing judgment to fall as they are. All right? If you find 50 righteous, says verse 24, will you destroy the city? That'd be far from thee to slay the righteous with the wicked. Shalt not the judge of all the earth do right? Lord said, if I find in Sodom 50 righteous, I will spare all the place. Note that. I'll spare it all for their sakes. Could it be that in Evansville, a city that is discounted by most of the world, in Grace Fellowship Chapel, a church that is discounted by most of the world, could it be that God is looking down and seeing believers actually doing what they're supposed to do, learning the Bible and living according to it? And that God says, I'm going to spare the United States of America because of that group of people. Now, I personally believe that's true. I don't know of many congregations or places like this one. Now, there are others, but they're getting few and far between. And what I'm saying is that the remnant principle is in effect here. And why I, as pastor, am crying out with regard to warning. If we compromise, if we lose our potency, if we numerically lose our spiritual status, and we're one of the few, where does that leave others? Well, unprotected and ripe for God's judgment. So he goes on and talks about 50. And then he says in verse 28, he doesn't push it much here. If there's a lack of 5 of the 50, will you destroy the city? And he says, well, if there are 45, I won't do it. And he brings him all the way down to 10. Verse 32. Let not the Lord be angry. Let me speak one more time. Peradventure, if 10 be found there, you won't destroy it. Okay? Now, what does this tell us? Why was Sodom destroyed? Because there were less than 10 people that were the salt of the earth in Sodom and Gomorrah. And that collectively, their sin being irrelevant, but their inner attitude of heart toward light was the question. And the fact that they were all in agreement with regard to it. Judgment fell on that geographical location, collectively on all those people, because of this reason. And that same judgment, though it won't be fire from heaven, it can be a similar judgment on the United States of America. Now, those are people near and dear to our hearts. Let's go to Matthew chapter 11. Let's see, where are we? Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. Now, we have purposefully avoided discussing, in this regard, salt making things more palatable. It does that. You put salt on food and it tastes good. But that wasn't the only reason that people in ancient times put salt on food. It was a protective. No germ would light on salt against the meat that you wanted it protected. And so therefore it was a preventative from corruption and discarding. And so Jesus uses this with regard to believers, and the same thing is true today. Chapter 5, verse 13. Salt of the earth concept. You, believers, are the salt of the earth, which simply means that as long as we maintain our status, the earth has a chance of not being judged directly by God. Why does God rapture his ambassadors before the tribulation period? Because ambassadors are emissaries of peace to those who are at enmity with another. When you withdraw your ambassador, you declare what? War. So, the point is, as long as the church is here, not raptured out, there's still this concept that is viable, which means let's stand our ground with regard to this, and be the protective agency and the preventative agency, which means that not only should we witness, but we need to be on guard with regard to the subtleties of the holiday seasons and how they can put us out of fellowship with our compromise and mindset. The minute we say with the world, it doesn't matter, it's Christmas, just let go of your standards and join in, at that point you have lost your potency as salt. And that was the problem with Sodom and Gomorrah. Note what Jesus said. But if salt has lost its savor, its potency, wherewith shall it be salted? It's henceforth good for nothing, but to be cast out, trodden under foot of men. So when you have the numerical or the potency decline of salt, and that's what happened here, where the percentage of the remnant got so small that God could no longer justly withhold his judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah, judgment fell. And I believe that this very same thing is possible with that of the United States of America. There's still a pivot of believers. There's still the few of us. We're pushing the envelope, but perhaps to this point we have not exceeded the limit. But the fewer people that are in the remnant, the worse it's going to get. And the more people that are in the remnant that compromise and lose remnant status, the worse it's going to get with regard to bringing God's long-suffering to the point where he is no longer long-suffering and he begins pouring out his wrath on a collective group of people. He's already doing it in areas around the world. That's why we have tsunamis. That's why we have hurricanes. That's why we have typhoons and volcanoes. That's why we have tornadoes and earthquakes and the like. And we have 3,000 to die here, 10,000 to die there. Whole countries decimated because of their voodooism and their demon worship and so forth. When the collective mindset becomes such, and they all begin this cry of protest toward God or direct their attention toward demons, God brings judgment on them. And probably there was not much of a pivot there except for whatever competent missionaries there might have been in the area. So, as we close this, and we'll take it up again on Wednesday night, keep the potency of your salt. It may be the only chance that our loved ones have for America to still be free and a functional society wherein the gospel might flourish for them.